Most expect me to begin with philosophy, a metaphor about water, perhaps, or some ancient wisdom passed down through generations. But the truth I'm about to share began with failure, raw, humbling, necessary failure. Let me tell you about a night that changed everything. Not in a temple, not under the guidance of a wise master, but in a cramped apartment in Hong Kong, 1957. I had just lost a fight. Not a street brawl or a challenge match, but something more intimate. A simple sparring session with a student half my skill level. I won, technically, but in that victory I felt a profound defeat. My techniques were perfect, my form flawless, and that was precisely the problem. I had become a prisoner of perfection, executing movements without truly understanding them, and that night, watching my own reflection in a dirty window, I saw something that thousands of hours of traditional training had hidden from me. The human body doesn't move in perfect angles. Combat doesn't flow in predetermined patterns. We had been learning to swim by practicing on dry land. The next morning I approached my master with questions, not with rebellion or disrespect, but with genuine curiosity. Why do we chamber our fists at exactly this angle? What happens if we deviate by just 2 degrees? Simple questions. Dangerous questions. His response wasn't anger, wasn't dismissal, it was fear. Not of me, but of the uncertainty these questions represented. Perfection lies in precision, he said. But nature, I had realized, finds perfection in adaptation. This began my real education. I started experimenting in secret, not out of defiance, but necessity. Each night I would take one traditional movement and break it down to its raw components. Not to reject tradition, but to understand it at a molecular level. What I discovered wasn't revolutionary because it was new, but because it was natural. The body already knew these truths. We had simply learned to ignore them. Like learning to walk by memorizing foot positions. We had overcomplicated something fundamental. The masters who later challenged me didn't understand what I was seeking. They saw a young man trying to break tradition. What I was really trying to break was the illusion that tradition and evolution must be enemies. Some of what I'm about to share will seem to contradict everything you've learned about combat. Other parts might appear deceptively simple. Both reactions are appropriate. Truth doesn't always arrive in the package we expect. I've kept these principles private not because they're secret techniques or hidden powers. I've kept them private because they're intimate discoveries, personal realizations that each practitioner must experience rather than simply learn. Today, I break this silence. Not because the time is right. Time is neutral. I share these insights because I see in the current generation of martial artists something I once saw in that dirty window. A readiness to question not just the answers, but the questions themselves. What follows isn't a new style or system. It's a map of my journey from imitation to understanding. Each principle I'll share is a door I found. Where these doors lead for you, that's the real discovery. Let's begin with the first principle. It started with a simple question. What if everything we know about power generation in martial arts is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human movement? The fight with Wong Jack Man taught me something that no victory ever could. Many know of this fight, but few understand its true significance. It wasn't the battle itself that revealed this principle. It was what happened in my mind during those 3 minutes. Halfway through that encounter, exhausted and frustrated, I experienced something profound. My trained responses, my perfected techniques, they began to fall away. Not because they failed, but because they weren't fast enough for my mind's perception of time. In that moment of crisis, body and mind shifted into a state I had never experienced. The traditional separation between thought and action vanished. This wasn't the much-praised flow state that athletes talk about. This was something far more fundamental. This experience led me to develop what I call conscious destabilization. The principle is counterintuitive. To achieve true stability, you must first embrace instability. Not just physical instability, mental, emotional, technical instability. In Seattle, I developed a specific drill. Stand on one leg. Simple enough. Now close your eyes. Feel how your body makes thousands of micro-adjustments. Most martial artists try to minimize these adjustments. Instead, I want you to amplify them. Let yourself wobble, but stay conscious of every movement. Your mind will panic at first. It's been trained to seek stability. But in this controlled instability, something remarkable happens. Your consciousness expands. You begin to feel not just your balance, but the process of balancing. This led to a deeper discovery, what I call neural pattern interruption. I first noticed this while training with James Coburn. He was a talented student, but struggled with a deeply ingrained habit in his right cross. Traditional correction methods failed. Then one day, by accident, we discovered something. Instead of trying to fix his punch, I had him perform it underwater. The resistance completely altered the feedback his nervous system received. When he returned to striking normally, his brain had been forced to create new neural pathways. The old pattern was disrupted. This connects deeply to the Chinese concept of Wai Shi, consciousness, but not consciousness as the West understands it. In traditional Chinese thought, consciousness isn't just awareness. It's the bridge between intention and reality. Think about that word, consciousness. In English, it suggests passive awareness. But Yishu implies something active, dynamic. It's not just about being aware of your movement. It's about being aware of the awareness itself. Through conscious destabilization, we create a state where this deeper consciousness can emerge. When you stand on one leg, wobbling, your mind becomes aware not just of balance, but of how it perceives balance. Not just of movement, but of how it creates movement. This is why traditional training methods often fail. They focus on achieving stability through repetition. But true stability doesn't come from repeating the same thing perfectly. It comes from understanding the principles that govern all movement. The drill I developed in Seattle evolved from this understanding. Start with physical instability, then add cognitive load. Recite a complex sequence of numbers while maintaining that unstable position. Your mind will want to separate these tasks. Don't let it. Force it to integrate them. This isn't about multitasking. It's about breaking down the artificial barrier between physical and mental activity. In reality, there is no separation. The distinction between mind and body is a construct that limits our potential. Remember the sensation you felt as a child, learning to walk. There was no separation between thinking and doing. Your entire being was engaged in the task. That integrated state is what we're trying to recapture, but at a higher level of consciousness. Through these methods, we're not just training the body or focusing the mind. We're rebuilding the bridge between them that our structured, compartmentalized training has broken. People often ask me about power, how to generate it, how to control it. But they're asking the wrong question. The real mystery isn't power, it's energy. Not the mystical energy that some martial arts schools teach, but something far more tangible and profound. I discovered this during a period of intense private training in 1967. I had pushed myself to exhaustion as usual. But this time something was different. In that state of complete depletion, I noticed something. My breath had changed. Not just its rhythm, but its relationship with my movement. Traditional Chinese medicine speaks of qi pathways, but I found something more fundamental. Between exhale and inhale, there's a microscopic pause, a moment of perfect stillness. Most breeze past this moment. But in that pause lies a secret about energy manipulation that changed everything I understood about combat. Try this. Exhale completely. Notice that brief pause before your body demands air. In that fraction of a second, your entire nervous system shifts. Now, instead of fighting this moment of vulnerability, lean into it. What you'll find is paradoxical. Supreme weakness becomes a door to supreme power. I developed what I call micro-recovery cycling. Most fighters think recovery happens between rounds or training sessions. But I discovered you could compress recovery into milliseconds. It's not about breathing faster or slower. It's about changing your relationship with energy itself. Danny Nosanto and I spent months exploring this concept. We developed an exercise that seemed impossible at first, maintaining maximum power output while simultaneously recovering, not alternating between the two states, but experiencing them simultaneously. This led to an even more profound discovery about the nature of time perception. We noticed that in these states of simultaneous exertion and recovery, our perception of time itself began to shift. Not in some mystical way, but in a very practical, measurable sense. The Taoists wrote about time being like a river that could flow at different speeds. Modern physics confirms this through relativity. But what I discovered was how to apply this principle in combat. It's not about moving faster. It's about experiencing time differently. Here's the exercise we developed. Begin with a simple punch, but throw it at quarter speed. Focus not on the movement, but on your perception of the movement. Now, without changing the physical speed, expand your awareness of each microsecond. You'll notice something strange. The punch feels faster while moving slower. This is what I call perceptual recalibration. Your body moves at the same speed, but your consciousness expands to fill the space between moments. It's not about slowing down time. It's about expanding your perception of it. The breakthrough came when we realized this wasn't just a mental exercise. The nervous system actually operates differently in this state. Your ability to process information accelerates while your physical movement remains constant. This creates a sort of temporal leverage, more consciousness in each moment of action. Think about how a high-speed camera reveals details in a water droplet splash that the naked eye can't see. Your consciousness can develop this same capability, not by speeding up your movements, but by expanding your perception of each movement. In training with Dan, we found this state was transferable. When one person enters this expanded time perception, they can actually pull others into it. It's like two dancers finding the same rhythm. But instead of sharing a beat, they're sharing a dimension of consciousness. This isn't metaphysical. It's a practical reality of human perception. Just as your eyes adjust to darkness, your consciousness can adjust to different time scales. The key is understanding that time perception is not fixed. It's a variable you can learn to manipulate. Remember, energy isn't just about power output. Time isn't just about speed. When you understand how to manipulate both, you discover that they're really the same thing, different expressions of the same fundamental principle. What I'm about to share began with one of my most humbling failures. It was 1969, and I had reached what I thought was the peak of my physical and technical development. My speed was unmatched, my power refined. Yet in a private sparring session, a novice fighter caught me completely off guard. The punch wasn't fast or technically sound, but in that moment, my consciousness was trapped in a single dimension of awareness. I was so focused on my own technical perfection that I became blind to the simple, unpredictable nature of real combat. This led me to explore what I call consciousness cycling. Take a simple movement, a basic straight punch. Now throw it 5 times, but each time from a completely different state of consciousness. First, analytical, aware of every technical detail. Second, instinctive, pure reaction. Third, environmental, total awareness of your surroundings. Fourth, energetic, focused on internal sensation. Fifth, empty, no focus at all. Most martial artists get trapped in one mode of consciousness. Traditional training reinforces this, teaching us to maintain a warrior mindset, a state of constant readiness. But true combat readiness isn't about maintaining a single state. It's about developing the ability to cycle between states instantly. Western psychology speaks of flow states and heightened awareness. Eastern philosophy describes different levels of consciousness. I found that the truth lies not in choosing between these states, but in developing the ability to move between them at will. Here's where most practitioners fail. They try to add new states of consciousness on top of their existing one. It's like trying to build a second floor without removing the ceiling of the first. You must first develop the ability to dissolve your current state before you can access another. This brings us to the concept of identity fluidity, which connects deeply to the Chinese concept of wu-wu, no self. In Hong Kong, I developed a training method that seemed counterintuitive at first. Instead of strengthening a fighter's identity, I would work to dissolve it. Start with a basic stance. Now completely abandon your conception of yourself as a martial artist. Let go of every technique you've learned, every principle you know. What remains isn't weakness, it's pure potential. This state of wu-wu isn't about becoming nothing. It's about becoming everything. I once demonstrated this in a real combat situation. An aggressive challenger approached me, radiating hostile intent. Instead of meeting his energy with my own fighting identity, I completely dropped into a state of no self. The effect was immediate and profound. His aggression met emptiness, and in that space, all his preparation became useless. The training method I developed involves rapidly cycling through different identities during practice. Not role-playing or pretending, but actually experiencing the dissolution and reformation of self. One moment you're a seasoned fighter, the next a complete beginner, then formless potential, then pure awareness. This isn't philosophical theory. It's practical combat psychology. When you can dissolve and reconstruct your identity at will, you become impossible to predict. Your opponent's preparation becomes worthless because they're not facing a fixed entity, but a fluid state of perpetual transformation. The breakthrough happens when you realize that your martial identity, all your training, all your techniques, is both your greatest strength and your greatest limitation. By learning to release it at will, you gain access to something far more powerful, pure, unfiltered, human potential. Remember, consciousness isn't just awareness of your surroundings or your techniques. It's awareness of awareness itself. When you can shift not just what you're conscious of, but how you're conscious, you enter a dimension of combat that most fighters never even know exists. Most martial artists mistake theoretical effectiveness for truth. I learned this lesson with Taki Kimura in a way I'll never forget. We were exploring a new training method I'd developed, one I was certain would revolutionize fighting. Taki stood there, patient as always, as I explained my complex theory about angular momentum and neural response. The principle seemed perfect on paper. The physics made sense. The anatomy aligned. Everything pointed to this being a breakthrough in combat efficiency. Test it, Taki said simply. Not in a controlled environment, not with a cooperative partner, but against pure, unpredictable resistance. What happened next shattered my intellectual understanding of combat. The technique failed, not partially, but completely. This wasn't just a failure of execution. It was a failure of understanding. In that moment, I learned the difference between theoretical truth and functional truth. This led me to develop what I call reality testing. Not just pressure testing techniques, but pressure testing the underlying principles themselves. Every assumption, every theory, every truth had to survive contact with chaos. The method was simple but brutal. Take any principle you believe in. Now create 3 scenarios where that principle should fail. Not might fail, should fail. Then test it against those scenarios. If your principle survives, you haven't created harsh enough tests. The hardest test I ever faced wasn't physical. It came when I had to question my most basic assumptions about power generation. I had built an entire framework of understanding around a particular principle of body mechanics. My reputation, my effectiveness, my identity as a martial artist, all rested on this foundation. The test revealed not just flaws in the principle, but flaws in how I understood truth itself. I discovered that truth in combat isn't a fixed point. It's a resonance. Like a tuning fork finding its perfect frequency. There's a feeling when something aligns with reality. This resonance can't be faked. It can't be theorized. It must be felt. When a principle aligns with truth, there's a physical sensation of rightness. Not emotional satisfaction or intellectual agreement, but a tangible feeling of alignment with reality. Think about throwing a simple punch. There's a moment when everything aligns. Body structure, timing, intent. That sensation of perfect alignment. That's truth resonance. Not because theory says it's right, but because reality confirms it. The scientific method gave us a framework: hypothesis, testing, observation, conclusion. But in combat, these steps happen in microseconds. You must develop what I call instantaneous empiricism, the ability to form, test, and validate theories in the midst of chaos. The most challenging aspect of reality testing isn't the physical demand. It's the emotional and intellectual humility required to truly subject your beliefs to failure. Most practitioners unconsciously protect their theories, creating tests designed to confirm rather than challenge. Remember, truth in combat isn't what works in theory, or even what works most of the time. Truth is what remains unchanged when everything else falls apart. That's why the most valuable tests are the ones that break our techniques, shatter our theories, and force us to confront reality without the comfort of our assumptions. Everything I've shared, conscious destabilization, energy manipulation, dimensional training, reality testing, they're all fragments of a larger truth. The real breakthrough came when I stopped seeing them as separate principles and recognized them as different expressions of the same fundamental understanding. It happened during a private training session in 1973. I was working with all these concepts simultaneously, not trying to combine them, just letting them exist together. Suddenly, every principle collapsed into a single point of understanding, not through intellectual analysis, but through direct experience. In that moment, I realized that all these methods were really about one thing: freeing the human organism from its learned limitations. The real obstacle was never physical capacity. It was our fundamental misunderstanding of human potential. Modern training methods focus on optimization, better techniques, faster responses, stronger movements. But they're still operating within the framework of what we believe is possible. True breakthrough comes from questioning the framework itself. Think about a child learning to walk. They don't study biomechanics. They don't analyze optimal foot placement. They experiment, fail, adapt, and discover. Their learning isn't limited by preconceptions about what's possible. This is the state we must return to, but with conscious awareness. Your path won't look like mine. It can't. These principles aren't meant to be replicated. They're meant to be rediscovered through your own experience. The methods I've shared aren't techniques to master, but doors to open, each leading to your own exploration. The synthesis happens naturally when you stop trying to synthesize. Stop trying to perfect these principles. Instead, let them fail. Let them contradict each other. Let them create confusion. In that confusion, in that failure, in that contradiction, that's where genuine discovery happens. Remember, the ultimate breakthrough isn't a new technique or principle. It's the realization that every technique, every principle, is just a temporary tool for exposing your own direct relationship with reality. Once you understand this, you'll stop seeking perfection and start seeking truth. Your journey begins where my explanations end. Take these principles not as answers, but as questions. Let them guide you not to mastery, but to mystery. Because in the end, the real discovery isn't what you learn about martial arts. It's what you learn about human potential itself. This is where I leave you. Not with a conclusion, but with a beginning. The true test of these principles isn't whether you can understand them or even apply them. The true test is whether they lead you to discoveries of your own. Remember this above all. The path of personal discovery isn't about becoming better than others. It's about becoming more fully yourself. That's the ultimate expression of these principles. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not mastery, but freedom. Udapungyu, we've come full circle. From that young man questioning traditional forms in Hong Kong, to these deeper truths about human potential. But this journey we've shared today isn't ending. It's just beginning. Look at your hand for a moment. Make a fist. Now release it. Simple, isn't it? But in that simple movement lies every principle we've discussed. The conscious destabilization as your fingers transition from one form to another. The energy manipulation in the tension and release. The dimensional awareness of each finger's position. The reality testing of what makes an effective fist. That's the beauty of these principles. They exist in every movement, every moment, waiting to be discovered. You don't need elaborate training methods or secret techniques. You need only to approach each moment with the curiosity of a scientist and the wonder of a child. The most profound truth I've discovered isn't about fighting at all. It's about the nature of discovery itself. Every time you think you've reached the limit of understanding, you'll find there's another layer waiting to be peeled away. That's not frustrating, it's liberating. These principles, conscious destabilization, energy manipulation, dimensional training, reality testing, they're not separate paths. They're different windows looking into the same room. Your task isn't to master them individually, but to find where they intersect in your own experience. Some of you will take these ideas and find applications I never imagined. Others will discover principles I never saw. That's exactly as it should be. True understanding isn't about replicating someone else's discoveries. It's about making your own. Remember, the real measure of understanding isn't in how well you can explain these principles, but in how naturally you can express them, not through conscious application, but through unconscious integration. As we part ways, I want to share one final thought. The greatest limit to human potential isn't physical. It's our reluctance to question what we think we know. Every breakthrough begins with a question. Every discovery starts with doubt. Embrace that uncertainty. Let it guide you. Let us continue to explore, to discover, to grow. For true Kung Fu lies not in the perfection of technique, but in the transcendence of self. The path is infinite. The journey is personal. And the discovery is yours.